We're exiting Stockwell Station on the Northern and Victoria lines on a beautiful warm autumn day in London.
Buy the house prices, kick out the Tories.
And today's video we're going to be looking at the London of Vincent van Gogh, who lived in the area in the 1870s. London is well known for being a collection of villages, and many areas have their own character, and indeed are famous for something or other. You might for instance focus on Camden Town with its myriad markets, Alperton for its South Asian atmosphere. You could visit Goupil Road, renowned for its connections to the Who. Straight ahead, if you walk far enough ahead from Stockwell here, itself famous for its Portuguese community, along this main road and you'll reach the Oval, known worldwide by fans of cricket. But on the way, and even more of a London speciality, is an area known for its connection to the artist Van Gogh. I'll call him Van Gogh in this video for British ears. For some reason the name in the UK seems to end in a double F sound, like the disgraced broadcaster Frank Boff. Perhaps it's all in the spelling. US viewers might know him as Van Gogh, and of course there's also Vincent van Gogh for purists. No area of London is without various places of interest, and before we properly discuss Vincent, however you pronounce his surname, this is one of them. Stockwell is one of 8 London Underground stations with an adjacent and brightly illustrated deep level air raid shelter constructed during the Second World War for 4,000 people. In 1802 the manor of Stockwell was sold, and these first houses here at Stockwell Terrace were constructed in the 1840s with the idea to form an elegant middle class suburb. I did promise you that this was a video about Van Gogh in London and not about terraces and middle class suburbs, so let's just cross Clapham Road here and we'll begin to tell the story of Vincent van Gogh. While it was always known that Van Gogh had lived in Stockwell, the precise address was undetermined for a long time. The link of 87 Hackford Road, and we'll pass the house in due course, to Van Gogh was only discovered in 1971 by a postman and avid Van Gogh enthusiast called Paul Chalcroft. There was a postal strike on in 1971, and he took it upon himself to locate Van Gogh's London home. Paul Chalcroft found out that Vincent's main address in London was, as I said, 87 Hackford Road, and once he'd discovered the house, much more detail about Van Gogh's London biography followed. At the age of 20, Van Gogh had arrived in London to start work at an art dealership, and I hope I pronounced this correctly. It was Goupil and Cie, I'll spell that, and they were in Southampton Street, Covent Garden. At first, Vincent lived in Brixton, and London was 20 times the size of any town that Van Gogh had previously known. When he first came to the city, he purchased a top hat, a symbol of the successful Victorian middle class. Van Gogh already had a love for English literature even before he arrived, and Charles Dickens in particular. He enjoyed rereading Dickens's Christmas stories every year, and continued to read the author until his death. In his letters home, Van Gogh mentions over 100 books by British authors that he liked, but his favourite novel was by John Bunyan, The Pilgrim's Progress. This is an allegory of a man who must travel on a path filled with many obstacles. Vincent spent 3 years in the city, walking its streets, crossing its bridges, and gaining inspiration from the surroundings. His time in Britain was truly a life-changing experience, influencing the art he'd begin making 4 years later. We're turning now into the beginning of what we might call Van Goghville, or however an area is called dedicated to one subject. It's not actually got that name at all, I've just called it that. There's lots of things named after Vincent van Gogh in the area. But before we get there, this is called Durand Gardens. It's a street of terraces, semi-detached and detached houses, and it was built from 1840 onwards. Originally it was called the Grove, like many other streets in London also called the Grove, and so in due course in 1893 it was renamed and it got the name Durand Gardens after Sir Mortimer Durand, who established the dividing line between India and Afghanistan that year. That caused no further repercussions at all in the future. One of the joys of doing these walks and purposely avoiding the main roads, even though I did Clapham Road a few minutes before, is discovering areas like this. It's a beautiful day and this is lovely. If I wasn't trying to locate Vincent van Gogh's house on this walk, I wouldn't be here at all. It's really great just going off the beaten track in London and discovering beautiful back streets just like these. Incidentally, if you want to do this whole walk and see everything on the way from Stockwell Station to Oval Station, I've got a full version of the walk elsewhere on YouTube where you hear nothing from me whatsoever. I just don't, and this one I'm not shutting up, I realise. And in the full version I say nothing. There's a link in the video description of this one to another video which is the full video of the walk from Stockwell Station to Oval Station. Straight ahead we got what's now called the Van Gogh Primary School. This is a classic Victorian design of a school. Lots of black and white 60s dramas featured primary schools like this, and they're still around in places. By the time Van Gogh became a lodger here, 87 Hackford Road had already had 50 years of history. It may have been built around 1824. When Van Gogh moved in during 1873, Mrs. Sarah Ursula Lawyer was living at the house with her daughter Eugenie and another tenant called Samuel Plowman. As a widow, Mrs. Lawyer was able to generate income by running a small school for children out of the front parlour and letting out rooms to lodgers, such as Van Gogh. With his career as an artist looming only in the future, Vincent was judged as a bit of a weirdo by the people he lodged with. And true to form, he fell madly in love with Eugenie. His feelings were documented in letters, dotted with Keats' poems of love and desire. His advances were, however, totally unrequited, and he became quite obsessive and a nuisance to the quiet Eugenie. Mrs. Sarah Lawyer asked him to leave and find new lodgings, which he did in due course in Kennington, but just before he was asked to leave, he produced this drawing of the house here. The drawing of the house was the key in 1971 of tracking down the address. Although the two houses on the right of the drawing were demolished, the remaining number 87 was obviously the same house, and Paul Chalcroft put all the evidence together. This was actually the first known piece of art that Van Gogh produced in his life. From August 1873, Vincent lived in Hackford Road, but the tube didn't arrive here until 1890, so he walked to and from work each day. It was a long way from Stockwell to Covent Garden. His usual route to work was up Hackford Road, then Caldwell Street, Clapham Road to the Oval, up Kennington Road, across Westminster Bridge, and then various different routes to Southampton Street. I've edited out a longer walk up Hackford Road, but you can see this in the other full video linked in the video description for this one. At the junction ahead, Van Gogh would have turned left into Caldwell Street, which in those days was suitably called Holland Street. They came along and renamed it later, but we're going to turn right. Having grown up in a middle-class home, Van Gogh was shocked by the poverty on the streets of London. He vowed to live a meaningful life. When he did decide to become an artist, he wished only to create art for the people. While in London, Vincent enjoyed visits to the Royal Academy to view favourites like John Constable and the Pre-Raphaelites. Later, Van Gogh would use English titles for some of his works, hoping that they would sell well in Britain. During his time in London, Vincent became more and more religious. It was at this time that he decided instead that he wished to pursue a career as a priest. He finally left London in June 1874, and soon after he was volunteering as a pastor in Borinage, a mining village in Belgium. Britain's rising socialism had influenced Van Gogh so much that he donated much of what he and the church had to the villagers of Borinage to alleviate their poverty. The church authorities were not best pleased at this and fired Van Gogh for harming their governance in the region. The next thing he did was visit Paris for the very first time, and the rest is history. Brixton Road dates back to the Roman era, when it's part of the road from London to Brighton. We had a glimpse across the rooftops of the Neo-Byzantine style Christ Church, and this was opened in 1902. And I should have got a close-up of the aforementioned church just here, but I noticed that I didn't. So you see the lower brickwork, which is not quite so interesting. But it would be churlish, given the name, not to go into this place, just for completion's sake, and to have a coffee. The good old 159 bus route. I think that this was the very last Routemaster route to survive back in the first decade of this millennium. Prima Road was laid out on land belonging to a banker, John Wright, and the River Effra flowed across the Clapham Road end of Prima Road, making the area very boggy. The Effra was built over between 1837 and 1857, and St Mark's Church paid £322 towards the costs. The raised banks of the Oval Cricket Ground, which is very nearby, were raised up with the earth excavated by the river works. Over there is the very same St Mark's Church, which paid for the Effra stuff. It was built on the site of the old Gallows Corner on Kennington Common, and on Saturdays a farmers' market is held in the churchyard, which we're shortly to visit because it's a Saturday.
Me gusta obviamente por el claro, que yo voy antes de...
I hate the awkward thing when you have to just pretend.
That was coming at 5:50.